Alright, hello Sagittarius. Welcome to my channel, where I just come out and tell you the things you wish your therapist would tell you. Um, so this month really revolves around Mercury retrograde. It begins June 29th and lasts through most of the month. And the main theme of this retrograde seems to revolve around childhood survival strategies. And for you, rather than getting into specific circumstances, there does seem to be a dynamic that is formed over time where there's a deep fear of being controlled financially or emotionally, and a strong drive towards being independent in every possible way, like hyper independence. But in order to gain this sort of stability and independence, because at some point, someone in your childhood was probably really was all about traditional values and stability and being pragmatic and, you know, don't mess with all this astrology nonsense and things like that. But in exchange for this stability, you sort of had to sacrifice some aspect of yourself. Maybe like things that you are truly interested in, like having to, like going and working a kind of a boring job that's really stable and it pays the bills and it gives you a sense of security, but it also kind of suffocates you because it's so routine and kind of boring. And then that sort of voice in the back of your mind that kind of wishes it could be doing something more adventurous and more like genuine to what you really want to do. Um, with the North Node here in your third house, kind of on the cusp of Pisces and Aquarius, let's look at the aspects here. Making negative aspects to Uranus and Mars in the sixth house. Um, I feel like there's probably a lot of stuff you wish you could say, but you just don't. You just bite your tongue because it might be controversial or it might sort of cause some kind of conflict. And with this very strong energy here of Uranus and Mars in the sixth, kind of in the seventh house as well, so it's probably kind of affecting both. There may be a desire to just like blow up your job or relationship, just completely just blow everything up and move on to something else. Consequences be damned. Or in some cases, it kind of almost can mean some of the opposite because, Mars can sometimes it's destructive, but sometimes it's also more motivational where you just feel super driven towards your work, or super driven towards working on your relationships. So it kind of depends on the person, but this is an explosive combination of energy here. Uranus with Uranus is like a lightning bolt. It's erratic, it's unpredictable, it's powerful, it's like a flash of something completely new and original, just raw energy. And then Mars is the destructive force. Um, and it's like, and that can also be applied like, in a sense, like working out, lifting weights is in a sense a destructive force. Using a destructive force, you're making little tiny tears in your muscle fibers so that they can grow stronger. Um, so it depends on how that's actually manifesting in your life. Though I kind of feel like there's just a strong but quiet sort of desperation just to kind of for adventure to embody that Sagittarian archetype of being autonomous and adventurous and free spirited and not pinned down, not being having to be too obligated to things. But at the same time, you've likely built up a life around yourself that you've put a lot of time and effort into. Maybe there are people who depend on you, or people who really kind of expect you to fulfill a certain role that for a long time you were okay with, but then gradually over time as you get older. And I've noticed that my entire viewership so far is over the age of 35, so this kind of makes sense for that, around that age range where you've built the career. Maybe you've got the marriage at some point, you've been in relationships, maybe some of you've had kids. You've done the things that society tells you you're supposed to do, and that probably one of your parents was really adamant about. Those are the things that are most important. And then you get to this point where, okay, I've done all those things. Why am I still not happy? Why do I still feel like this urge to just kind of blow everything up and go on an adventure? Um, and in some cases, maybe when exploring like higher philosophy and higher learning, that's when you feel most like in your zone, where you feel like you are really in your element, and people can kind of see that and be attracted to it. But it's like there's just this conflict between the insistence upon stability and financial autonomy and a fear of being in a situation where you might potentially be controlled or manipulated by somebody else by needing to rely on their resources or needing help in some way, and people being able to hold their finances or manipulate you emotionally in some way. So there has to be, if this is something that you find is happening in your life, finding that balance is going to be a challenge because these two desires are kind of at odds with each other. There's the desire for freedom and the desire for stability and security. I mean, there's the freedom of having lots of money so that you can go buy stuff whenever you want or try to protect yourself from the so-called random happenstance of life. But that's not really freedom because you're completely bound and beheld to certain tasks and things that you have to spend a lot of time on that you don't particularly want to do. So is it really freedom if you have to spend all your time doing things you don't particularly really want to be doing? But then there's the freedom of like autonomy and like just not being beholden to anything that sort of holds you down. But with that comes a lot of uncertainty. And I think, as far as this chart goes, the first step here is really just talking about these things. Don't just go, burn all the bridges and just throw yourself at it so that you have no way to go back, but maybe at least expressing to some degree, if you have a partner and you don't want to just leave them behind, but you're also feeling kind of suffocated in your current life, just speaking about it, talking about it. Even if it's an uncomfortable conversation, it's better than trying to suppress it and pretend like everything's okay until things finally do explode. Kind of and letting the sort of the more wild side out a little bit at a time instead of just I mean, if you want to just blow the whole thing up, that's totally an option. But I feel like that will very often leads to feeling like, well, maybe I should have been a little more careful with that. Maybe I went a little too far to the other extreme. I don't know what sort of specific circumstances may have led to, this sort of feeling of this fear of being controlled, this need for hyper independence with Lilith over here in the first house, feeling, and over here in the fourth house where we have Saturn, there's just a feeling that is not entirely clear. It's just a feeling that you can't maybe quite put your finger on exactly, of being restricted, like your real self, your individuality is being restricted by this sort of gilded cage that you may have built around yourself out of the fear of, losing autonomy. And dismantling that in a way that leads to a more happy life is going to be a delicate process. Things have to be kind of changed a little bit at a time, even though there may be a desire to just, set fire to the whole thing and just move on. To each their own, but, speaking from experience, usually making rash decisions to kind of blow things up like that very often doesn't end up working out as well as you might think. Uh, but hey, some of us have to learn the hard way. With Chiron over here making the aspects that it's making, I won't go into all the technical details, so that might get boring fast. But maybe it was likely that one of your parents had just they were really all about traditional values. They probably say things like life isn't supposed to be fun. It's not all fun and games. You have responsibilities, and maybe they glorified the idea of suffering. Um, because that's just what life is. Just a lot of these kind of axioms that tend to come from older generations for the most part. Um, but I think on some level, that's not fundamentally true. But maybe this sort of, discouragement from just fun and games maybe was taken a little too far and has kind of created a trap. So it's much better to address the feelings that come up in relation to these kinds of situations and identify them, observe them, see what comes to your mind. If you ask this sort of underlying kind of feeling of restriction, like what are you? What is this? What do you want? And just pay attention to what comes up. The subconscious very often will serve up exactly what you ask for, like right away. But there's a tendency to kind of second guess it or dismiss it as, oh, it's just my imagination. Well, just your imagination. That's kind of a really reductive way of looking at it, because what is imagination really? But we'll get into that maybe in another video. So anyways, I think I'll leave it at that. If you want to get deeper into what's going on with you, send me a message or check out my website where you can schedule private readings. If you like these videos, be sure to like and subscribe and leave comments because it helps me out a lot. And until next time, take care.